Today I'm going to show you 10 ways to make your riffs sound heavier. Let's not waste any time and let's get straight into it. The first tip is to downtune your guitar. Now this might sound like an obvious one, but don't underestimate it. The heaviest bands that I listen to are also the ones that tune the lowest. Now of course there might be exceptions to this rule, there are always exceptions to any rule, but generally you want to be downtuning your guitar. So take a listen to an example that I created. I first of all play the riff in drop D, and then I play it again in drop A so you can hear how much heavier it sounds. The second tip is to target the correct note. So creating heavy riffs is all about creating an intense and aggressive atmosphere, and the major scale isn't really going to cut it here. That being said, you don't need to choose a specific scale, but you need to make sure you target the right notes to create the right vibe. So you want to be targeting the darker and more dissonant intervals. So the best ones to target will probably be the flat second, the flat third, the flat fifth, and the flat ninth. If you can use all of those in your riffs, then you're gonna have some really heavy sounding riffs. So take a listen to a riff that I've created. I'm not using any particular scale, but I'm just making sure I target those darker sounding notes. And the riff does sound pretty heavy. The next tip is to use advanced rhythms. The element of surprise can really contribute to a riff's heaviness. Using advanced and unexpected rhythms can really throw the listener off, especially when you throw a really low note in when it's least expected. One way to do this is to use polymeters. Of course, the masters of doing this are Meshuggah. This is the band I've learned to do this from. So I'm going to take a leaf out of their book for the following riff that you're about to hear. So the riff you're about to hear is in 17/8. I'm playing the riff in 17/8. The kick drum is following along and is synchronized to the riff. So the kick drum's in 17/8 as well. Now polymeter being where you play 2 time signatures at the same time, or more than 2 time signatures. I've programmed in the drums to play a 4/4 rhythm on the crash and the snare, just the standard 1, 2, 3, 4. That 4/4 rhythm with the drums allows us to groove whilst the 17/8 riff is still playing underneath. The length of the riff being 17/8 can really surprise the listener because the listener won't be sure where the riff starts and ends. Longer riffs allow you to do this more effectively. Alternatively, if you have a shorter riff, then you can maybe just change something about it each time you repeat it, and then that can throw the listener off as well. So here's the riff. The next tip is articulation. So sometimes it's not what we're actually playing that makes the riff heavier, it's how we play it. Now there are loads of different ways to just play one note on the guitar. You could play a grace note leading into it. That's where you quickly kind of like hammer on or slide into a note from another note. You could add vibrato to the note, you could bend it, you could use slides, harmonics, all sorts of things just to play one note. The guitar is a very expressive instrument and we need to take advantage of that. Using all of the different options we have for articulation not only makes your riffs sound heavier, but it also makes your riffs sound more exciting to listen to. You'll also want to decide which notes you want to palm mute. Okay, so palm muting can make your riffs sound heavier. And even with palm muting, there is a level of choice there. You can palm mute a bit closer to the bridge, which makes the palm muting sound a bit more staccato. Or you can just palm mute very lightly, which gives the strings a sort of like purring sort of sound. So it's like, sounds muted, but there's still some sustain there. Equally, you want to play some open notes as well. That can make your riff sound really heavy when used at the right time. So it's all about experimenting and seeing which notes are best palm muted and which notes are best played open. Another little tip I like to use is picking closer to the bridge for a sort of twangy sound. It's used a lot in country, but of course, if you want that, dare I say it, genty sound, you can kind of play a bit closer to the bridge and it gets a more twangy sound in your tone. So here's a riff that I wrote. The first time round, I'm literally just playing the notes as kind of plainly as possible. The second time round, I'm adding as much articulation as possible so you can hear the difference. It's quite subtle, but definitely noticeable. So the next few tips are all going to be about contrast. We know what a heavy riff sounds like, but why do we call it heavy? we call it heavy because we've heard things that aren't so heavy before. If every riff in the entire universe was heavy, then no riffs would be heavy, if you know what I mean. There wouldn't be softer riffs to compare it to call it heavy. So the first type of contrast we're going to be taking a look at is between high and low notes. Now we don't really associate higher notes with being heavier, but when we can use them in conjunction with lower notes, it makes those lower notes sound even lower and then makes them sound heavier. One of the things I like to do is use the panic chord. It's where we play a semitone interval, play both notes at the same time, very dissonant, and if you play it really high pitch, it can be quite jarring, and then when it's contrasted with a really low note, it sounds really awesome. So take a listen to a riff that I've created using contrast between high and low notes. I've tuned the lowest note of my guitar lower than all the other riffs in this video just to enhance the effect a bit more. I've tuned it down to an E, so it's an octave below standard tuning. The next type of contrast is the tempo change. Now the good old tempo change is a great way to make a riff sound heavier. This is where contrast is so helpful. If there was a riff being played slowly, it would sound heavy, but it sounds even heavier when you play that riff faster beforehand. So I'm going to be playing the following riff 3 times. There's going to be 2 tempo changes, getting slower each time, and you'll see it gets heavier when I slow the riff down. Continuing with the theme of contrast, we're going to contrast our heavy riffs with the clean section. Again, it's purely the contrast that makes it sound heavy. If you played the riff on its own, yeah, it will sound pretty heavy, but it sounds even heavier when you've got something to contrast it with, aka a clean section. So take a listen to the example I've created that does just this. Now pauses are another kind of contrast. They create a lot of tension and a sense of unease as you never know when the next note is going to come in. It creates that little bit of discomfort that really makes your riff sound heavier, and when the note does come in after a pause, it just gives it that extra bit of impact. So here's an example that I created. Take a listen. Okay, the final tips are going to be about how we can change things around the riff and not the riff itself. As I said earlier, we want to create an intense, aggressive sort of atmosphere. One of the ways we can do this is to add atmospheric sounds in the background. I like to use synths, I like to use clean guitar chords, and I like to use the post-rock style tremolo picking with a ton of reverb and delay to achieve this effect. So take a listen to the before and after. The first time I play the riff, there's no atmospheric sounds. The second time, there is, and it just makes the riff sound a little bit more intense. And the final tip is to change the drums. So again, we don't need to change the riff, we can just change what the drums are doing to make the riff sound heavier. So here are a few things you can do with your drums to make your riff sound heavier. So usually in metal, the kick drum is kind of synchronized with the riff. Whatever the rhythm of the riff is doing, the kick drum is doing as well. Now what you can do is you can really minimize the amount of beats that you play with the kick drum just to emphasize specific notes. Another thing you can do is half time the drums. This is a great way to make the riff sound heavier, and it can even trick you into thinking that there's been a bit of a tempo change. And cymbal selection can really have an effect on the heaviness of a riff too. So if you've got a riff with the rhythm being played on the hi-hat, it will still sound heavy, but it will sound heavier with the crashed cymbal. And then it can even sound heavier if you use the China cymbal. It's more aggressive, isn't it? Obviously, you don't want to use these all the time. You want to use a variety of different cymbals. So when you want your songs to sound the heaviest, you use those really chunky sounding cymbals. So take a listen to what I've written for this tip. Again, I'm playing the same riff multiple times, but I'm just changing what the drums are doing to make the riff sound heavier. So thanks for watching the video. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe to the channel as there's going to be more content like this to come soon. See you later.